Welcome, everyone, again. I'm so glad that you're here with us today. As Britt mentioned, I am a coordinator and a consultant on older adult ministries. And so today, here we are, one of our webinars that we are offering to you as one of many that comes across this year. So this topic is one that we know can be very difficult. It's also one that we've heard from many is a primary source of need or wish for them to have conversation about. So, for whatever reasons that you are here today, we are going to be talking about the topic of grief and loss on many different levels. So that listen carefully for what you personally might find in terms of comfort or guidance from it, but also what your church or your group or a possible support group might learn or hear from our time today, as well as if you're a Silver Chalice church. There are some programs that we could offer to you on this topic too. So it will be broad and wide ranging, even though we have just an hour. It will include our two presenters who will introduce themselves in their good time, which is Kimberly Weir and David Hargrave, both pastors and chaplains. Also, we have a very special speaker today who's going to share a little bit about her new work and special project, and that is Darthula Young. So, before we get started on this topic today, I'd invite you also to jot down your thoughts or questions because we will have a breakout room time and then we will have a returning whole group conversation time in the second half. Also, you can look ahead tomorrow to an email that will come to you about the resources that we have chosen and vetted that we recommend on this particular topic, as well as the names and the links for information that you might seek in the future. I would ask you to join me in a brief commentary for a thoughtful moment. This is a section of something that is written by John Rodal, who is known to be writing poetry for his conversations with God. And this is one of those. So God says, "There is something worse than grief." And John replies, "Well, what's that?" God, "Feeling nothing. Let grief come. Let it stay as long as it needs to. Let it go. Let it come back. It's all a process. It's all a slow boil." John, "So my grief will never end?" God, "Not as long as you love the one who is gone. But that doesn't mean that your grief won't take 1,000 different forms. Sometimes your grief will look like clouds or tears or memories. Grief is formless. It will come and it will go like the tide. Don't fight it. Don't race through it. Don't let other people tell you how to grieve. Your grief is your own. Honor your grief. And with those thoughts, I'd invite Kimberly to share what she has of her experience, her knowledge, and her gifts. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thanks, Jan. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I am in Jacksonville, Florida. I am a chaplain and executive director of the Florida Senior Enrichment Center, which supports about 300 low-income older adults in HUD-subsidized independent housing. Was a hospice chaplain and pediatric chaplain before that. And so I'm just honored to be here with you today. And I imagine that you all have different experiences and expertise related to grief. Many of us in different kind of places with that. So I wanted to just start out by saying that part of what I'm sharing, or what I'm sharing here, especially at the beginning, is some of what I use in the start of a grief support group. One of the things that we have heard people say is that they would like to start a grief support group in their community. So, for those of you who've wondered about that, this is kind of part of how I start out. And so if we could start with our first slide, thank you so much. We're going to start with some definitions, some just basic definitions. Grief, we describe as an internal experience. Grief is the feelings that you have, such as fear, panic, anger, guilt, etc. And we distinguish that from mourning, because mourning is how those feelings are expressed externally. So, for example, the feeling of sadness, which is grief, can be expressed as tears, which is mourning. Why do we distinguish between the two? Why is that important? Well, that is because mourning is the process of working through or reconciling, integrating the grief that we feel. To grieve without mourning, without ways of outwardly expressing our feelings, can be dangerous and destructive to the body and the spirit. Now, reasons for grief. There are all kinds of reasons beyond just the death of a loved one, although that is definitely a reason. Loss of relationship, change in or loss of a job, change in our health, recognition of dreams or plans that aren't coming true. There is grief that caregiving brings when you're caring for a loved one, especially one with dementia. So I invite you to think of other reasons, and there are many, many reasons that we grieve. Some other terms to be familiar with, and we'll talk about, I'll talk in a second about anticipatory grief, cumulative grief or compounded grief, and then also complicated grief, in addition to talking about normal grief, which is where I'll kind of start. I know normal is can be a complicated word. I hesitate using it, but for description purposes, the Mayo Clinic has a nice definition of quote, normal grief, mentioning that different people follow different paths through the grieving experience. The order and timing of these phases will vary, not may, they will vary from person to person. And there's always there are also sometimes gender differences with grieving that are good to be aware of. Accepting the reality of loss, allowing yourself to experience the pain of loss, adjusting to a new reality in which our loved one is no longer present, and having other relationships. These differences are normal. But beyond that, we can talk about some those other types of grief. So we talked about complicated. I mentioned complicated grief. Complicated grief is persistent and it is long term, generally thought to be over a year, and it interferes with day-to-day living. Now, of course, recent grief is going to interfere with day-to-day living, but this is more complicated grief is thought to be more long-term, and it's often related to feelings that aren't given air or space to be fully felt or expressed, mourned externally. That is just a kind of a basic definition of complicated grief. Anticipatory grief, that is when we know or anticipate that the loss is coming. And we start those feelings of grief in advance. And this is often common in people who are caring for a loved one with dementia, what we call sometimes the long goodbye, because we know and anticipate the decline in function. And we tend to grieve that ahead of the actual loss. That's anticipatory grief. And then cumulative grief, I don't know that it's something that we all think about, but I'll give an example. I was leading a support group and there was a gentleman, he was 60 years old, or yeah, 60, he was 60, yeah. And he had a wife who passed away. His wife died, and then his sister also died 3 months before that. And the man was very troubled by the fact that he didn't cry when his wife died. He didn't shed tears at the funeral either. But about a month later, after the funeral, their dog died. And he hasn't been able to stop crying. And he wondered what was wrong with him, that he couldn't cry for his wife, the love of his life for many years, but could cry at the drop of a hat over his dog's death. And he would come to group and he said, "What is wrong with me?" And the reality is that since his sister and then his wife died the month before, he had been dealing with all kinds of losses. Because when someone dies, there's the grief of missing that person's presence, physical presence, but there's also the grief over the loss of the life that was expected, of dreams and visions of the future that were changed. There's the loss of identity from being a caregiver to no longer having that caregiving role, as well as having to now take over tasks that were previously done by the other person, just to name a few. So it took time to provide assurance to this wonderful man that there was nothing wrong with him, that this was an example of cumulative grief. In the description of our webinar for today, one of the descriptions, the wording was to provide support and resources when grief is unresolved. And I just wanted to share that I have mixed feelings about that word resolved, because it gives the impression that grief is a problem to be solved that eventually has a resolution. And as a chaplain who lives in the world of grief with patients and families, and as a person who is grieving the death of my own son, I can truthfully share that grief will never end or disappear. I don't look at it as a problem to be solved, and I actually don't ever want it to go away, as strange as that may sound. My son lives on through my grief, my memories, my emotions, the way I outwardly mourn his death. They're all important and honestly life affirming, as every breath that I take. So what we hope for this webinar is to help identify what grief is, when it's complicated, and how we can help ourselves and those around us to integrate our grief in ways that don't just take us down. So I'd like to talk for a second about the Christian response to grief. One of the ways that we can help is by being mindful of what we as church-going Christians think and say out loud to ourselves or someone who is grieving. And I imagine this section may be preaching to the choir, so to speak, so thank you for indulging me. But I would feel remiss if I didn't at least touch on this. And I invite you to chime in with a reaction, like a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a heart or a head shake, with what resonates with you here. But you are already aware of these statements, but I cannot begin to tell you the harm that they can do. So first of all, when you are with someone after a loss, someone grieving, silence is truly golden, golden. And if you are questioning what you are about to say to someone, I invite you just to not say anything. And that's hard for us because it's not natural or how we were trained. But being present, just being present, is sometimes all and the most that would be needed. So make yourself resist the urge to use words. 9 times out of 10, that's the best gift. And if the silence is too much, depending on your relationship with this person, then perhaps you can say something as, "I'd love to hear more about that." Or ask a question such as, "What are you struggling with the most right now?" And as far as what not to say, I will invite you to help me with this, and you can maybe talk about this when we do our breakout sessions, but I'm going to start us off. One of the phrases that I just ask us not to say is, "Well, at least he's in a better place." At least he's in a better place. And I wonder, do we have time to get other thoughts? Nope, don't. Okay, keep going, Kimberly. Got it. So what is so wrong about these normal phrases that we use? First off, they are said mostly because of our own need to say something, and they're not comforting. Whether you believe them in your core or not, when we are in our deepest grief or someone is in their deepest grief, they do not necessarily want to hear that God planned for our loved one to die or that God orchestrated the car accident to teach us something, or even that God allowed it for reasons that we could not understand. So These kind of responses and beliefs can absolutely add to grief and can actually make it more complicated. So the message that we want to give is that God walks with us in our suffering, not that God caused it because he needed another angel in heaven, which is true words that someone wrote in a card to me. So when we go through our own losses, it causes us to re-examine what it is we believe about who God is. What kind of God do we put our trust in? And all of that might be questioned while people are grieving. It may be that we grew up with one understanding of God that isn't fitting with our own experience during our grief. So as those offering support, it's a wonderful opportunity to validate the person's feelings. And it's even important to validate the confusion. And it's not the time to come with answers. It's a time to listen. There's a poem that I like to share in the very first session of a grief support group that we're going to send you tomorrow in the support material, but it's called Please Listen. And just look for that in the follow-up material tomorrow. Romans 12:15 says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And this is the scripture that resonates with me when I think of grief and loss. We want and need a witness, and we need people or ourselves who will give us and others permission to wallow a bit. We are the ones in the room to witness to that person's pain and heartache. And if you are the one grieving, then you know the importance of having someone else not try to fix, but to simply be there, allowing us to have the full range of feelings that we're experiencing in that moment. So I'd like to wrap up my section of this webinar by sharing a post that came across on Facebook recently as I was preparing. A wise monk told me, feeling a feeling fully is how it passes. When you fight it, it lingers. When you numb it, it waits for you. But when you allow it, really let yourself feel sad, angry, or scared, your body gets the message that it's safe to move through it. That's how emotions complete their cycle. Thank you so much for listening to this part. I will now toss it over to David. David.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you very much. Good morning, all. I'm glad to be able to share with you some of my own experiences and learnings in the arena of loss and grief. Recognizing that grief is in and of itself, I believe, a traumatic event in one's life. We all, I would expect, have witnessed and experienced both. For 5 years, I watched my daughter grieve the death of her sister. It was certainly a traumatic event, one from which she never fully recovered, and which likely contributed to her own death 5 years later. In my professional life, I pastored many individuals dealing with the loss of loved ones. And now as a chaplain in a senior living facility, I interact daily with folks who are dealing with recent, long-term, or what I call closeted grief. This is particularly challenging to handle with those who find themselves in various forms of dementia. In addition to the residents, we here at Juliette Fowler are also beginning to reach out to the families of those residents, people who are dealing with the trauma of losing loved ones over a prolonged period of time, as Kimberly mentioned. My first comment is that in working with older residents, I've realized that aging, like grief, is traumatic, be it the physical effects, the loss of mental acuity, the loss of loved ones, loneliness, isolation, and that isolation can be chosen or imposed. Any number of these circumstances can be traumatic, and trauma creates grief and vice versa. Going beyond this developmental trauma, there are individual traumas that only exacerbate grief. It may be chronic or acute illness or injury. It may include various disabilities, recent or long-term, and it may include psychological disturbance, recent aging-related, or a lifelong malady. Finally, as a chaplain, I've become increasingly aware of the reality of spiritual trauma. And I believe Kimberly really hinted toward that in some of her remarks about our Christian response to grief. Again, that spiritual trauma can be either recent or long-term. It's significant just how long-term spiritual trauma can impact one's life. It's worth noting at this point that if the effect of these traumas go beyond the individual's well-being to the effect they have on relationships, especially when living in a large community of traumatized people. One experience I've had was leading a grief recovery group, as Kimberly talked about, and that leadership came somewhat automatically as the chaplain, an opportunity to get to know residents at a deeper level than in the context of worship or study groups. That being said, a chief learning for us here came with the opportunity to turn that leadership over to a licensed social worker who did not have that pastoral relationship with the residents as did I, who has training and experience in psychological counseling. The group has flourished under her leadership. And among our learnings is the reality that in an institution such as ours, with a significant population who live in subsidized housing, the intensity of mental and emotional issues is significant. The grief process is not an isolated one. It's intermingled with the remainder of life experiences we've had. Dementia, of course, is a grief-ridden development in any person's life. I learned this some 30 years ago now after my mother experienced a severe stroke, the effects of which were both expressive and receptive aphasia. Simply put, she was unable to say what was on her mind and frustrated in understanding what was being said to her. It turned out to be a 10-year journey in grief. Grief over what she had been versus what she was now. It was hard to witness and no doubt far harder to experience. Today, I'm interacting daily with those who are in various stages of dementia. I recognize the frustration, the pain, and the embarrassment of people who have been productive citizens, reduced to only wishing to recall why they find themselves in a certain room. Traumatic is somehow too benign a descriptor. Now, to be sure, a major part of our work with and service to dementia patients is not merely sympathy, but empathy. In dementia-friendly terms, we are determined to relate to dementia patients where they are. It's been a learning time for me, for instance, that among the effects of dementia can be a dulling of emotions. When I assume a particular emotional reaction to a story, a song, or a memory, that assumption is often unfounded. Thus, meeting a resident where they are demands a fair amount of listening, openness, flexibility, and understanding. So what might I suggest as a forward path in the midst of all this traumatic grief or grief-ridden trauma? Take your pick. The first tactic might be to treat mental and emotional trauma much the same way as physical trauma. First step is triage, examining the person to connect symptoms with injuries. This is where our listening skills come in, as Kimberly talked so well of. More than passive hearing, as Paul Simon wrote in Sounds of Silence, but listening actively. Second step, moving from examination to diagnosis or evaluation. What indeed is the source of the trauma, or sources, plural? We have to be open to the possibility that the trauma has more than one root cause. We know that we are always helpless to cure the original trauma, but knowing and understanding that traumatic reaction is the goal. And finally, compassion. Cultivating the ability within ourselves, quite simply, to love one another as we would wish to be loved in similar circumstances. We know, don't we, that we all have a measure of traumatic grief with which we are dealing. And each of those measures are just as critical as the other. It is not helpful, in my experience, to view one's grief and trauma as more or less than another. For the person experiencing it, it's critical. In short, in all traumatic relationships, lead with compassion. Thank you for listening. I now turn it back over to, I believe we will go into our breakout rooms, I believe.
That's right. And thank you so much, David and Kimberly. We'll see you in our rooms in just a moment. Thank you all for the time you spent sharing and offering your thoughts and ideas on this topic. I know that in a few minutes we will have some time to just discuss a little bit about what was heard or what meant a lot to you. But before that, I promised you our special guest speaker today. We have Mrs. Darthula Young with us. She has a wonderful project and program that she's developed and created, and I've asked her to just share briefly, but you'll know that the information about Darthula will be coming to you also in an email tomorrow, among our other contacts and resources. But thank you, Darthula, for agreeing to share with us today, and welcome.
Thank you, Jan. My name is Darthula Young. I was a cohort for the National Benevolent Association. I am now an Incubate Partner with the National Benevolent Association located in Chicago, Illinois. I am an end-of-life doula, or a death doula, and I was certified because I needed to have the tools and the knowledge about what happens when you come to end of life. We are a group, we are an organization, nonprofit, and our main constituency is underserved, overlooked, marginalized, and BIPOC communities. We conduct workshops and seminars on how you plan, prepare for end of life. We do not plan and prepare for end of life on any level. Most of us don't. So where we start is, how do you have those conversations? Think about how many people have actually been able to have that conversation with their family about what exactly you want when you come to end of life. What kind of care, where do you want to be, who do you want to be around you? And we operate on what we call the 6 pillars of living and dying: spiritual, emotional, mental, legacy, and practical. Practical is what and how we want our remains disposed of. We also go through a whole session on documents. How many of us really have all of our documents in order? Healthcare power of attorney, durable power of attorney, last will and testament, which is not as important as we have always thought it was. But do we need a trust? How many people are on the deed to our property? How many people are on the bank account? How do we stay away from going into probate, for our property to go into probate? So we spend a lot of time talking about how do we stay out of probate and ensure that our assets are distributed to our beneficiaries or the people we want? Medical care, curative care, palliative care, hospice care, which is the most important because a lot of folks don't understand that hospice care is comfort care. And in the faith-based community, we believe that only God can determine when you die. And you're right. However, when you go into hospice care, then there needs to be some type of preparation and you need to get the medical intervention that you need, which could be pain management. So I spent a lot of time, and if you're doing hospice at home, most people don't understand 98% of the responsibility for hospice care at home is the family. And most families are not trained to do that. So we also talk about hospice care and then the stages of death. Do we really know what death looks like? When our loved one stops eating and drinking, that's a process. Our bodies know how to die. And once we get to that point where our spirit is struggling to leave the body goes into different phases and begins to die. And most people don't understand and recognize death. And then what do we do when our loved one dies? Expected or unexpected? Each state has laws in place to determine how you process or how you dispose of your remains and how you report it. Only a funeral director can pick up a body. What happens if it's unexpected? What process do you go through? If the coroner or the medical examiner gets involved in the death or becomes a crime scene. So we walk people through that as well as rituals. Every culture has different rituals. We do a lot of research on how a culture honors and prepares their loved one when they come to end of life. So that's a lot that we do. And disposal of the remains. There is, a traditional funeral, cremation, both fire and water. There's water cremation right now. There is natural burial, and plus there's composting. I'm sure a lot of you were not aware that you can compost your body. When it becomes dirt, you can get the dirt and you can do what you want with the dirt. So we go through that and also the cost. And then the rituals. We make sure that the rituals are covered, but also something that we added because it was asked is the caregiving. We are all caregivers on one level or other. The Surgeon General came out and said that being a parent is a caregiver. Like we didn't know that and we didn't know what it brings, but also to make people understand how important, and Jan, you talked a lot about this self-care. You might have 5 minutes, especially when you are dealing with someone who has dementia. And once you get to the seventh stage of dementia, that is when people die. There is no cure. And I have so many people that I spend time with whose loved one is suffering from dementia. And at some point, you might have to put your loved one into a facility because you cannot provide the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week support. So I'm going to wrap up with saying I am available. I talk to individuals. I work with individual families. I get a lot of calls from people who don't know what to do. They're in this position, they're dying, and they have no clue of what's next and what should I do. Or my mother's in a sleep coma. What does that mean?
Yeah.
The timing on death too. I am willing to travel. I will travel, come out, do some workshops, about an hour and a half, and just spend time talking about death and dying because we all gonna die.
Yes.
Sooner or later. I hope I took my 5 minutes.
You did great, Darthula. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you. And I know this is, we wanted to have a little more time at the end for questions and thoughts, but we're going to do that now for just a few minutes at least. If there's anything you wanted to share about the conversations today, something you've learned, something that struck you in particular, we have just a couple minutes before Jan closes us out. What would you like to share?
Kimberly, this is Cindy Deach.
Hi, Cindy.
And I don't know if you remember me or not, but I
Of
remember
course.
you.
I do.
But this was so good today. Very helpful.
I'm I'm so glad, Cindy. So good to hear your voice. Thank
Good to see you.
you.
And if my hair looked better,
All right, Susan.
Yes, hospice was brought up. Thank you, Darthula, and others who were talking about it. In dealing with my mom some years back in Louisville, Kentucky, my mom finally decided she did not want to come back to the hospital again and made that very firm. And I brought the doctor in, and he said, well, you realize I can't be your doctor anymore if you go on hospice. And that's what you mean by this. And he was a little about, and, loss of a patient, money, but whatever. But she was under hospice for a year and a half. Mm-hmm. And it was not what so many people think of hospice. It was not, well, last chance, last hope,
Right.
last thing to do. And I have been an activist telling people, as many as I can get, told that don't look at hospice as a last resort.
Amen and amen and amen. Yes, no one ever says that I should have waited to call in hospice. They always say I should have called in hospice sooner. So thank you for that. Thank you. I'm going to kick it back to Jan to wrap.
Kimberly, you can go in and out of hospice. The doctor
Absolutely.
usually says 6 months or less. Jimmy Carter was in hospice for 2 years. But what people have to understand, like she said, once you go into hospice, they stop curative care. If you decide you want to go back, you can say, I want to go back to palliative or curative care, and they'll start treating you again.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you all so much for this. I'm going to kick it back to Jan. I know she wants to wrap up our time together. And if she'll tell you this too, if you have other comments, other thoughts about the workshop, you have an opportunity to share that as well. Jan?
It's been such a rich hour. We're just so grateful. And I hope that you have found some things that have been informative and new to you or affirming and repeated for you. So important. As Kimberly mentioned, and as I have mentioned, the resource will be emailed you with a listing of some of our recommendations and ideas for you. Of course, there'll be many more, but that email will also invite you to offer us comments, feedback, and so on, questions. We always limit ourselves to 1 hour. We know we scratch the surface, but we get you thinking, and we hope that you'll come back again for another time. And at that same time, we feel so gifted by the fact that you have spent this hour with us on this topic. So as we begin to wrap up our time together, and as we wish we had more time to share, I would like to share with you a blessing as a closing. This is written by Kate Bowler, called Good Enough. It's written as the Beatitudes. Blessed are you, friend, sitting among the shards of what could have been. Blessed are you, dear one, letting your eyes look around and remembering all the hope your dream once contained, all the love, all the beauty. Blessed are you, telling your tears they can flow, telling your anger it can speak. Blessed are you when mourning is the holy work of this moment. It speaks of what is real. Blessed are you letting this loss speak all its terrible truth to your soul. Blessed are we who mourn, saying, let us remain in grief's cold winter for as long as it takes. That morning might be to our hearts the gentlest of springtime. Blessed are we, and blessed are we to be with you. Thank you once again, and blessings as you go into the rest of your day. We look forward to hearing and seeing you again very soon. Bye-bye.